Never split the difference. Negotiating as if your life depended on it by Voss and Tahl Raz. A sleepy summary. Once upon a time, there was a man named Voss, and Voss spent a very, very long time talking people out of doing terrible things. He was an FBI hostage negotiator, which is exactly the kind of job that sounds exciting in a movie, but in real life involves a lot of sitting in vans, drinking bad coffee, and saying things like, "It sounds like you're feeling unheard right now," to people who are holding other people at gunpoint. Chris got very, very good at this. He got so good at it that he eventually ran the whole FBI hostage negotiation operation. And then, after he retired, he decided to write a book about everything he learned so that the rest of us, who are not negotiating for hostages, but are maybe trying to get a better deal on a car or ask our boss for a raise without having a panic attack, could also be pretty good at it too. And so he sat down with a writer named Tahl Raz, and together they wrote Never Split the Difference, which is a book that will gently but firmly convince you that everything you thought you knew about negotiation is wrong, and then it will teach you the right way. And by the end, you will feel very capable and also a little sleepy, because we are going to go through the whole thing right now, slowly and thoroughly, like a warm bath for your brain. So let us begin at the very beginning, which is a very good place to start, especially when you are trying to fall asleep and need something interesting enough to follow, but not so exciting that your eyes pop open. Chris starts the book by telling us about a training exercise he did at Harvard, at the program on negotiation, which is a very prestigious place full of very smart people who had spent decades building what they believed was the definitive, rational, logical framework for negotiation. The framework was called Getting to Yes, and it was developed by a man named Roger Fisher, and it was based on the idea that negotiation is fundamentally a rational exercise. You figure out what you want, you figure out what the other person wants, you look for areas of mutual interest, you make logical trades, and eventually you both end up with something reasonable. It was a very tidy theory. It made a lot of sense on paper. It was also, Chris discovered, not how human beings actually work. Because here is the thing about human beings, they are not rational. They think they are rational. They tell themselves they are rational. They build elaborate theories about how rational they are. But when you actually sit down across from a real person who is scared or angry or proud or desperate, and you try to apply a rational framework to them, what you discover is that their emotions are running the show, and their logic is just the story they tell afterward to explain what their emotions already decided. And if you are going to be a great negotiator, you have to understand that. You have to meet people where they actually are, which is in a swirling sea of feelings and fears and needs and hopes, and you have to work with all of that rather than pretending it doesn't exist. Chris went to Harvard and sat down with a graduate student to practice negotiating, and the graduate student had spent years studying rational negotiation theory, and Chris, using none of the rational theory and all of the emotional, intuitive, empathetic techniques he had developed in the FBI absolutely cleaned the floor with him. Not because Chris was smarter, but because Chris understood that negotiation is not a logic puzzle. It is a human interaction. And human interactions run on feelings. This is the central thesis of the whole book, and it is worth sitting with for a moment before we continue, because everything else that follows is built on this foundation. The foundation is, emotions are not obstacles to negotiation. Emotions are the negotiation. If you learn to work with emotions, your counterpart's emotions and your own, you will become a dramatically better negotiator. If you keep trying to suppress or ignore emotions in favor of pure logic, you will keep losing to people who understand how humans actually work. All right, let us continue. Let us talk about the first big technique, which is called active listening, and which sounds like the most obvious thing in the world until you realize that almost nobody actually does it. Active listening, in Chris's framework, is not just hearing the words that someone says. It is making someone feel genuinely, completely, unmistakably heard. And this is different from what most of us do in conversations, which is wait for the other person to finish talking so that we can say the thing we already planned to say. Most of us, when we are in a negotiation or a difficult conversation, are so focused on our own position, our own arguments, our own next move, that we are barely listening to the other person at all. We are just waiting for them to stop making sounds so that we can start making sounds. And the other person can feel this. They always can. And when they feel it, they become more guarded, more defensive, more entrenched in their position, because nobody opens up to someone who isn't really listening. But when you actually listen, when you give someone your full, undivided, genuinely curious attention, something remarkable happens. They start to talk, and talk, and talk. They tell you things they didn't plan to tell you. They reveal their real concerns, their real fears, their real needs. They open up in ways that give you enormous amounts of information. And information in negotiation is everything. The FBI, Chris tells us, used to have a rule of thumb. In any hostage negotiation, the goal is to keep the other person talking. Because as long as they are talking, they are not doing anything violent. And more than that, the more they talk, the more you learn, and the more you learn, the more leverage you have, and the more rapport you build, the more trust you develop, and the more trust you develop, the more likely it is that you will be able to find a solution that gets everyone out alive. Listening is not passive. Listening is the most powerful, active thing you can do. And now we come to one of the specific techniques that Chris teaches for active listening, which is called mirroring. Mirroring is almost absurdly simple, which is part of why it works so well, because people do not expect simple things to work that well, and so they do not guard against them. Here is how mirroring works. You repeat the last 1 to 3 words that the other person just said in a slightly questioning tone, and then you wait. That's it. That is the whole technique. If someone says, "I just don't think we can make this work," you say, "You don't think you can make this work." And then you shut up. And what happens is that the other person, compelled by the deep human instinct to elaborate and explain themselves when prompted, will keep talking. They will say more. They will explain what they mean. They will reveal more of what is actually going on for them, and you will learn more than you would have learned if you had responded with a counter-argument or a question or a statement of your own position. Chris tells a story about a time a bank teller used mirroring on him accidentally and naturally, and how effective it was. He was at a bank, and he wanted to withdraw a large sum of money, and the teller seemed reluctant, and instead of explaining or arguing, the teller just kept gently repeating back the last thing Chris had said. And Chris found himself elaborating and explaining, and eventually providing all the information the teller needed to feel comfortable with the transaction. He walked away from that experience thinking, that person is a natural negotiator and does not even know it. The reason mirroring works is rooted in something deep in human psychology. We are wired to be suspicious of people who are very different from us and to trust people who are like us. When someone mirrors us, when they use our own words back to us, when they match our pace and tone, we unconsciously perceive them as similar to us, as understanding us, as being on our wavelength. And we open up to them. We trust them more. We collaborate with them more. It is almost impossible not to, because it is happening at a level below conscious thought. Now, let us move on to something that is perhaps the most emotionally sophisticated technique in the book, and that is tactical empathy. Tactical empathy is Chris's term for the deliberate, skillful practice of understanding and acknowledging the feelings and perspective of the other person in a negotiation, not agreeing with them, not validating their position, not saying they are right, just demonstrating clearly and unmistakably that you understand how they are feeling and why they are feeling that way. And within tactical empathy, the most powerful specific tool is something called labeling. Labeling is when you identify and verbalize an emotion that you sense the other person is experiencing. You say things like, "It seems like you're frustrated by how this has gone," or "It sounds like you're worried that this won't be taken seriously," or "It looks like this situation is really important to you." You name the feeling, you put it out there, you give it a word. What this does is remarkable. When someone is in the grip of a strong emotion, fear, anger, frustration, sadness, and that emotion is sitting there unnamed and unacknowledged, it tends to grow. It fills up all the available space. It makes it hard to think or talk or cooperate. But the moment someone names it, the moment someone says, essentially, "I see that feeling you're having, and I'm not afraid of it, and I'm not going to pretend it isn't there," the emotion starts to lose its power. It deflates a little. The person feels seen. The defensive walls come down just a notch, and real conversation becomes possible. Chris tells us about a study done with brain scans that showed something fascinating. When you label a negative emotion, when you put a word to it and acknowledge it, the activity in the amygdala, the part of the brain that generates fear and anger responses, decreases. You are literally, through the act of labeling, reducing the neurological intensity of the other person's emotional state. You are calming them down at the brain level, with words. Now here is something crucial about labeling that Chris is very particular about. You start with, "It seems like," or "It sounds like," or "It looks like." Never with "I." You do not say, "I think you're angry." You say, "It seems like there's some frustration here." The reason is subtle but important. I statements make the label about you, about your perception, about your interpretation. They subtly shift the focus to you and can feel presumptuous. It seems like, or it sounds like statements make the label tentative and observational, like you are noticing something rather than diagnosing someone. This keeps the focus on them and makes the label feel less like a judgment and more like a gentle mirror. And one more thing about labeling: when you do it, you do not immediately fill the silence that follows. You say the label, and then you stop talking, and you let the other person respond to it. Because the value of the label is not in what you say, it is in what they say next. Their response to the label is where the real information lives. Let us continue, because we are just getting warmed up, and there is so much more to cover, and the night is long, and the pillow is soft, and we have many more pages to wander through together. Chris introduces a concept he calls the accusation audit, which is one of those ideas that seems counterintuitive at first, but makes complete sense once you understand it. An accusation audit is when you, at the start of a difficult conversation or negotiation, proactively list all the negative things the other person might be thinking or feeling about you or your position. You get there first. You name all the bad things before they have a chance to say them. You might say something like, "I know this probably seems like I'm asking for too much. I know it might look like I haven't taken your concerns into account. I know you might be thinking that this is a one-sided proposal." And then you lay out what you actually want to say. This works because of a very human dynamic. When people have negative thoughts or concerns that they are not expressing, those unexpressed thoughts are running like a background program, consuming mental and emotional energy, making them less able to actually listen to you and engage with you. But when you name those concerns for them, when you say, essentially, "I already know what you might be thinking, and I'm not hiding from it," several things happen. First, the concerns lose their power, because unexpressed anxieties are always much bigger and scarier than named ones. Second, the other person feels understood rather than having to fight to make you understand. Third, you demonstrate a kind of honesty and self-awareness that builds trust. And fourth, you take the wind out of the sails of any attack they were planning to make, because you've already said the thing they were going to say, and it sounds much less devastating coming from you than it would coming from them. Now let us talk about something called the no, which is one of the most radical reframings in the entire book, and one that Chris seems almost gleeful about, because it flies so directly in the face of conventional negotiation wisdom. Conventional negotiation wisdom says, get to yes. The goal is yes. Yeses are progress. Nos are obstacles. The entire getting to yes framework is built around the idea that you are trying to collect yeses like coins. You ask for small yeses to build momentum. You look for ways to get agreement. Yes is the destination. Chris says, this is completely wrong. No is your friend. No is where the real negotiation begins. No is not an obstacle, it is an invitation. Here is why, when someone says yes too quickly, it is almost never a real yes. It is a counterfeit yes, a yes that means I want you to stop pressuring me, or I'll agree now and figure out how to get out of it later, or I need a moment to think and yes is easier than dealing with this right now. A quick yes is a fragile thing. It can evaporate overnight. It often does. But when someone says no, that is real. A no is a statement of where they actually stand. A no means they feel safe enough to push back. A no means they are engaged. They are not just trying to get rid of you, because getting rid of you would be a yes. A no means they have something they want to protect, and if you can understand what that is, you can find a way to address it. Moreover, no gives the person who says it a sense of control and safety. When someone says no, they feel like they are protected, like they have established a boundary, like they are not being steamrolled. And paradoxically, this feeling of safety, this feeling of having established control, makes them more open to continued conversation, more willing to explore options, more likely to eventually move toward a yes that is genuine rather than defensive. So Chris teaches his students to invite no, not to fear it. One of his techniques is to actually ask questions that invite a no at the start of a conversation. Is now a bad time to talk, rather than is now a good time? The person says no, it's not a bad time, which is functionally a yes, but they said no, and it felt like their choice, and that small sense of autonomy and control sets a collaborative tone for everything that follows. Another powerful no-inviting question is, have you given up on this project? Or in a customer service situation, do you want your company to fail? Nobody wants to say yes to those questions. They say no, absolutely not, and in saying no, they recommit to the thing you actually want them to engage with. It is a little bit counterintuitive and a lot bit effective. Now let us drift gently into one of the most useful and beautifully simple concepts in the whole book, which is the concept of the late-night FM DJ voice. This is exactly what it sounds like. When you are in a tense or difficult negotiation, when emotions are running high and things feel precarious, you shift your voice into a slow, low, calm, warm, downward inflecting tone, the kind of voice that a late-night radio host uses, the kind of voice that immediately communicates. Everything is okay. We are going to work this out. There is no emergency here. I am with you. This voice is almost supernaturally effective at de-escalating tension. It does not matter what the words say, the voice quality itself communicates safety and calm, and this is going to be okay, and the human nervous system responds to that. Hearts slow down, breathing deepens, the fight-or-flight response dials back, conversation becomes possible. Chris also talks about two other voice types. The playful and warm voice, which is the one to use most of the time. It communicates openness and ease and good humor and makes interaction pleasant. And the direct, assertive voice, which should be used sparingly, only when you truly need to be firm, because it creates distance and can trigger defensiveness if overused. The late-night FM DJ voice is the special tool, the one you reach for when things are difficult, the one that can almost literally calm a crisis. Let us continue our journey through this book, because we have covered the listening and mirroring and labeling and tactical empathy and the glory of no. And now we come to something that Chris calls the accusation-busting power of "that's right." That's right, not you're right. But that's right is, Chris argues, the most powerful thing you can get someone to say in a negotiation. When someone says you're right, they are often just trying to get you to stop talking. They are acknowledging that your words exist without actually changing anything about how they think or feel. You're right is a dismissal dressed up as an agreement. But that's right is different. That's right is what someone says when they feel genuinely, completely understood, when the thing you said so perfectly captured their view or their concern or their experience that they couldn't help but affirm it. That's right is a moment of genuine connection, and in those moments something shifts. Resistance softens, collaboration becomes possible. How do you get someone to say that's right? You listen to them deeply and completely. You mirror what they say. You label their emotions. You summarize their position so accurately and completely, including the parts they didn't say out loud but implied, that they feel seen all the way down. You demonstrate that you have not just heard their words but understood their world. And when you get it right, that's right is what you hear. And that is when you know you have built the kind of rapport and understanding that real progress is possible from. Now let us talk about time, because time is one of the most underrated tools in negotiation. Specifically, let us talk about the power of deadlines and how they can be both a threat and a tool depending on which side of them you are on. Most people, when they are in a negotiation and someone tells them there is a deadline, experience that deadline as pressure. They feel the clock ticking, they feel anxiety rising, and they make concessions they would not otherwise make because they are afraid of running out of time. This is the conventional response to deadlines, and it is, Chris says, mostly irrational and almost always counterproductive. Because here is the thing about deadlines, they are almost always more flexible than they appear. The deadline that your counterpart presents as hard and immovable is usually neither of those things. It is a tactic. It is meant to make you feel pressured. And if you don't let it make you feel pressured, if you stay calm and continue to work the negotiation rather than panic conceding, you will often discover that the deadline moves, or disappears entirely, or turns out to have been set arbitrarily in the first place. Chris tells the story of negotiations he has observed where one side was so worried about the deadline that they made enormous concessions right at the end, just to close the deal before the clock ran out, only to discover afterward that the deadline was artificial, that the other side would have waited indefinitely, that there was no real pressure except the pressure they had manufactured for themselves. The lesson is, take deadlines seriously as information. They tell you something about what the other person wants and when they want it, but do not let them take over your nervous system. Stay present, stay calm, keep working, and remember that the other person has a deadline too, even if they haven't told you what it is. And here is something else about time that Chris teaches. The person who seems least invested in closing the deal, the person who appears to have the most time and the least urgency, has enormous power. Not because they are callous, but because their willingness to walk away, their lack of desperation, their sense that they have options, communicates something very powerful to the other person. It communicates that this is not the only deal in the world. It communicates that you are okay either way. And paradoxically, this makes the other person work harder to make the deal happen. Now we come to one of the most practically useful and immediately applicable concepts in the book, and that is the concept of bending reality through strategic framing, particularly through the use of something called loss aversion. Loss aversion is one of the most robust findings in all of behavioral economics. It simply means that human beings, as a general rule, feel the pain of losing something much more intensely than they feel the pleasure of gaining something equivalent. If I take $10 from you, that loss feels about twice as painful as the pleasure you would feel from finding $10. This is deeply irrational by the standards of classical economics, and it is deeply, reliably, universally human. What this means in negotiation is that framing your proposal in terms of what the other person stands to lose if they don't agree is generally more powerful than framing it in terms of what they stand to gain if they do agree. If we don't close this deal, you'll lose access to the market window that's open right now lands harder than if we close this deal, you'll gain access to the market window that's open right now. Same information, very different emotional impact. Because the brain processes potential losses with more alarm and urgency than it processes potential gains. This is not manipulation, or at least, it does not have to be, as long as the thing you are pointing to is real. It is simply understanding how human decision-making actually works and communicating in a way that is congruent with that reality. If there is a real deadline, a real risk, a real opportunity cost to not acting, framing it as a loss is simply being honest about the stakes in a way that the human brain can actually register. Chris also talks about the concept of anchoring, which is the well-documented psychological phenomenon where the first number in a negotiation establishes a kind of gravitational center that all subsequent discussion tends to orbit around, even when both parties know intellectually that the anchor was arbitrary. The first number you hear has an outsized influence on where the negotiation ends up. This is why skilled negotiators are very thoughtful about anchoring, about whether to anchor first or let the other person anchor, and if they anchor, how extreme or how moderate to be. Conventional wisdom says don't anchor first, because if you name a number before you know what the other person is willing to accept, you might leave value on the table. But Chris's view is more nuanced. Sometimes anchoring first, anchoring with an extreme number, an audacious anchor that establishes a very favorable reference point for your side, can dramatically shape the range of the negotiation. The other person's counter will be influenced by your anchor even if they reject it as unreasonable. And if the final settlement is somewhere in the middle, your extreme anchor will pull that middle much further toward your preferred outcome. The key is to anchor in a way that doesn't completely destroy the relationship. You don't want to anchor so aggressively that the other person laughs and walks away. You want to anchor in a way that is extreme but not absurd, that makes your real target number look like a reasonable middle ground by comparison. Let us now spend some time with one of the chapters that feels almost like a magic trick, which is the chapter about the power of how questions, specifically the calibrated question, which is one of the most elegant tools in Chris's entire toolkit. A calibrated question is an open-ended question that begins with how or what, never why, because why tends to put people on the defensive, as if they are being interrogated or accused. Questions like, how am I supposed to do that? And what does success look like to you? And how does this affect you? These questions are calibrated in the sense that they are carefully designed to accomplish specific things, to make the other person do the work of thinking about solutions, to reveal their true priorities and concerns, to give them a sense of agency and control, and to buy time and gather information. The how question is particularly powerful as a resistance technique. When someone makes a demand or an ultimatum that you cannot or will not accept, instead of saying no, which creates conflict, you say, how am I supposed to do that? This is not a yes, but it is also not a no. It is an invitation for the other person to engage with the practical reality of your situation. It moves the conversation from positions to problems. It makes them an active participant in figuring out how something can work, rather than an adversary insisting that you simply comply. How am I supposed to do that? Said with genuine curiosity and not defensiveness or aggression, is also a mild form of accusation audit, because it implicitly communicates, I hear what you're asking, I take it seriously, I want to help you get what you need, and I also need you to help me figure out how. It builds collaboration. It invites partnership. It keeps the conversation alive and productive rather than shutting it down with a flat refusal. And here is something that Chris mentions that is absolutely delightful. The best negotiators make the other person feel like they are in control of the conversation even when they are not. By asking calibrated questions, by inviting the other person to solve problems, by creating the illusion of agency and choice, a skilled negotiator keeps the other person engaged and productive and feeling good about the process, even while steering it exactly where they want it to go. It is not deception. Both parties are working toward an agreement, but the navigation is happening quietly, through questions, through active listening, through the patient accumulation of understanding. Let us talk now about The Black Swan, not the book by Nassim Taleb, but the concept as Chris uses it, which refers to the unknown unknowns in a negotiation. The hidden, surprising pieces of information that once discovered completely change the picture. In every negotiation, no matter how well you have prepared, no matter how much research you have done, there are things you don't know that you don't know. There are facts about the other party's situation, constraints, motivations, fears, or alternatives that are not visible to you and that you would not even think to ask about. These are the black swans of negotiation, and finding them or creating conditions in which they naturally emerge is one of the most valuable things a skilled negotiator can do. Black swans are so named because before the discovery of Australia and its actual black swans, Europeans believed that all swans were white. The existence of black swans was literally unimaginable, outside the known range of possibility. And then, when they were discovered, everything about the category of swan had to be reconsidered. In the same way, a black swan in negotiation is a piece of information that, once revealed, reframes the entire situation. It might be a constraint you didn't know the other party was working under, a deadline you didn't know about, a relationship they have with a third party that changes the dynamics entirely, an alternative they are considering that explains why they seem so unmoved by what you thought was a compelling offer. How do you find black swans? You listen, you watch, you stay curious and open. You do not spend all your time in a negotiation locked into your prepared positions. You spend a lot of it simply paying attention, picking up signals, noticing inconsistencies, asking open questions, and letting the answers surprise you. You build enough rapport and trust that the other person eventually lets things slip, not because you tricked them, but because people, when they feel genuinely heard and respected, have a natural tendency to share more than they planned to. Chris tells us that one of the most reliable places to look for black swans is in what seems inexplicable or irrational about the other person's behavior. If someone is behaving in a way that doesn't make sense, if they are resisting something that should clearly benefit them, if they are insisting on something that seems counterproductive, if they are reacting with emotion that seems disproportionate, that is almost always a signal that there is something you don't know. That there is a black swan hiding somewhere, a piece of information or context that would make their behavior completely sensible once you understood it. The lesson is, do not dismiss behavior you don't understand as irrational or crazy. Treat it as a message. Treat it as an invitation to keep asking, keep listening, keep looking, until you find the thing that makes it make sense. Because almost always it does make sense from where they are standing, with what they know, given what they need. You just haven't seen their full picture yet. Now we come to a chapter that Chris dedicates to the art and science of discovering what the other person's true constraints are, the concept of knowing their world. This is about preparation, about the homework you do before you ever sit down across from someone. It is about trying to see the negotiation from their side. What do they need? What are they afraid of? What pressures are they under? Who else in their organization or life has to approve or is affected by whatever they agree to? What would success look like for them, not just what would success look like for you? Chris is a big believer in preparation, but not the kind of preparation that most people do, which is to rehearse their own arguments and figure out their own positions. He believes in the kind of preparation that is about the other person, about doing the work to understand their world so thoroughly that you can anticipate their concerns, their objections, their needs, and their constraints before they ever have to tell you. One of the practical tools here is the concept of knowing who the actual decision makers are in any organization. Often, the person you are negotiating with is not the person who actually has the power to say yes. They might be an intermediary, a representative, someone who can say no but cannot say yes. And if you get a tentative agreement from this person without understanding who actually needs to sign off, you are going to be blindsided when they come back and say, I need to check with my boss, or our legal team has to review this, or we need approval from the board. This is not necessarily bad faith, it is just the reality of organizational decision-making. But knowing about it in advance, asking questions like, how does this process work at your organization? And who else will be involved in finalizing this, can save you from enormous frustration and wasted effort. Chris also talks about something called the Rule of Three, which is a technique for confirming that an agreement is genuine and not just a polite brush-off. Getting someone to say yes once is easy. Getting them to say it 3 times is harder, and if they are genuine about it, they will do it without hesitation. If they start to waver, to change the subject, to give a slightly different answer the second or third time, that tells you something important. The first yes was not real. You have more work to do. You can get the same concept affirmed 3 times without asking the same question 3 times, which would be annoying and transparent. The first time they say yes. The second time, you summarize what they agreed to and ask them to confirm. So just to make sure I understand, you're committed to X. And the third time, you might label something. It sounds like you're really confident this will work. If all 3 get genuine affirmations, the agreement is solid. If any of them gets hesitation or hedging, you've discovered something important before you've committed. Now let us wander through the concept of actionable bargaining, which is a specific and very effective system for making offers and counteroffers in situations where you are bargaining over a price or a number. This is the kind of tactical, mechanical side of negotiation that sits alongside all the emotional and empathetic work, the nuts and bolts of how you actually move from an opening position to a final number. The Ackermann system works like this. You start by deciding your target price, the price you actually want to reach. Then your opening offer should be well below that target or above it if you are the seller, typically 65% of the target. Then, when the other party inevitably counters, you make a series of increasing or decreasing offers that approach your target in a very specific pattern. You go to 85%, then 95%, then 100%. But, and this is crucial, your increments get smaller with each step. The jump from 65 to 85 is large. The jump from 85 to 95 is smaller. The jump from 95 to 100 is smaller still. And if you need to make one final concession, it should be a small, odd number, something like $2,347 rather than $2,000, because oddly specific numbers communicate that you have done precise calculations and have very little room left. Round numbers suggest arbitrary choice. Odd specific numbers suggest that you have hit the wall, and this is genuinely as far as you can go. Why does this work? Because it creates a feeling of progress in the negotiation. The other party sees you moving toward them, while also managing their expectations. As your increments shrink, they can feel that you are reaching your limit. They begin to calibrate their expectations downward, and the odd final number creates the impression of precision and finality that makes it much harder for them to push further. Chris also counsels that you should always attach non-monetary items to your concessions. Throw in something that costs you very little but might have value to them, not as an additional offer, but as a sweetener to soften the emotional impact of the negotiation. Because a negotiation that is purely about money feels like combat. A negotiation that involves some additional gestures of goodwill feels like collaboration. And collaboration is where the best agreements come from. Let us now slow down a little and sink into something that Chris addresses toward the end of the book, which is the question of how to handle genuinely difficult people, people who are aggressive, irrational, manipulative, or just plain mean. Because not everyone you negotiate with will be a good faith actor. Some people are liars. Some people are bullies. Some people will use your empathy and openness against you if they can. How do you deal with those people while still being an effective negotiator? Chris's answer, perhaps unsurprisingly, is that the techniques he has taught you work especially well on difficult people, because difficult people are almost always running on fear. The aggression and the bluster and the manipulation are almost always a cover for something, for desperation, for insecurity, for a terrible alternative that they don't want you to know about, for a fear of losing something important. And if you can stay calm enough and curious enough to look past the aggression to the fear underneath, you will find exactly the same human machinery that you would find in any other negotiation. The same need to be heard, the same need to feel in control, the same emotional logic driving the rational surface. This does not mean you should be a pushover with aggressive negotiators. Chris is very clear that you should never let yourself be bullied. But the way you resist a bully is not by meeting their aggression with your own aggression. That just escalates into a pointless pissing contest where no one wins. The way you resist a bully is by being completely, imperturbably calm, by refusing to be rattled, by continuing to listen and ask questions and label emotions no matter how the other person behaves. Because nothing deflates a bully faster than someone who simply won't be bullied. If you don't give them the reaction they are trying to provoke, they have nothing to work with. And eventually, if you stay calm and patient and curious long enough, even the most aggressive counterpart usually reveals what is actually going on. Because people do not sustain maximum aggression forever. Eventually, exhaustion or curiosity or a surprising gesture of understanding breaks through, and the real conversation can begin. Chris also addresses the specific problem of someone who is outright lying to you, presenting false information in order to manipulate the outcome. The answer here is partly in preparation, knowing your facts thoroughly enough to recognize contradictions, and partly in calibrated questions, which invite them to elaborate and therefore create more opportunities for the story to become inconsistent, and partly in patience. Lies are hard to maintain consistently over time and across multiple conversations, and if you keep the dialogue going, the truth usually surfaces eventually. He also notes that the emotional tells, the tiny inconsistencies between words and tone, the slight over-explanations, the moments of too eager agreement, are often visible to a careful observer, and that active listening, which keeps your attention fully on the other person rather than on your own next move, makes you much better at picking up those signals. And now let us talk about one of the most profound and generous ideas in the entire book, which is the idea that the best negotiators are not adversaries, but problem solvers. That the goal of negotiation is not to defeat the other person, but to find an agreement that is genuinely good for both parties, that takes care of their real needs as well as yours, that leaves both sides feeling respected and satisfied rather than one side feeling triumphant and the other side feeling fleeced. This is not naive idealism. It is actually the most practical approach because agreements that feel good to both parties hold. They get implemented. They create the foundation for ongoing relationships. They generate goodwill that has value far beyond the immediate transaction, whereas agreements that feel bad to one side, where one person walks away feeling they were manipulated or exploited, do not hold. They get renegotiated. They get litigated. They destroy relationships. They cost more in the long run than the value extracted in the short run. The deepest application of everything Chris teaches, the listening, the labeling, the calibrated questions, the finding of black swans, is in service of this larger goal, to understand the other person well enough to find an agreement that genuinely serves both parties, not to trick them into agreeing to something that only serves you, but to understand them well enough to find the agreement that actually works for everyone, that satisfies their real needs as well as your own, that solves the actual problem rather than just winning the surface contest. This is what separates a great negotiator from a merely competent one. A competent negotiator can get a good deal for themselves in any given transaction. A great negotiator can build a relationship, can create the conditions for ongoing collaboration and trust, because their counterpart walks away from the negotiation feeling better than they expected to, feeling understood, feeling respected, feeling like the process was fair and the outcome was reasonable. That feeling is enormously valuable, and it is something that only skilled, empathetic negotiation can produce. Chris ends with the reminder that all of this, every technique, every framework, every concept requires practice. You cannot read about mirroring and immediately do it naturally in a high-stakes situation. You have to practice it in low-stakes situations first. You have to make it a habit. You have to use it in everyday conversations, at the coffee shop, with your family, with your co-workers, until it becomes second nature. And only then, when it is automatic and comfortable, can you rely on it when the stakes are high and your nerves are working against you. The book is, at its heart, an invitation to become a more careful listener, a more curious person, a more empathetic presence in every conversation you have. Not just in formal negotiations, but everywhere, in every difficult conversation, every moment of potential conflict, every time you need something from another human being and they need something from you, which is, if you think about it, most of life. So here is the complete journey of the book, laid out gently one more time like a lullaby of ideas. Start by listening, really listening all the way down. Use mirrors, repeat the last 3 words, and let the silence do its work. Label the feelings in the room. Give people the comfort of having their emotions named and acknowledged. Build toward that magical, That's right moment when someone feels so completely understood that they cannot help but confirm it. Love the no, don't fear it. Let your counterpart feel safe and in control by saying no, and understand that no is where the real negotiation begins. Ask calibrated how and what questions that invite your counterpart to do the work of solving problems. Use the late-night FM DJ voice when things get tense and watch the room settle. Be aware of anchors and deadlines and loss aversion and the ways that framing shapes perception. Use Ackerman bargaining when the negotiation gets down to numbers. Hunt for the black swans, the hidden pieces of information that can completely change the picture. And always remember that your goal is not to defeat the person across from you. Your goal is to understand them well enough to find the agreement that is actually good for both of you. That is never split the difference. That is the life's work of an FBI hostage negotiator distilled into a book, offered to all of us who are not negotiating for hostages, but who are, in our own daily and professional lives, constantly in the business of working with other humans toward outcomes that require both parties to give and take, to listen and speak, to understand and be understood. It is a book about talking, yes, but more than that, it is a book about listening, and about the extraordinary, almost magical things that become possible when you genuinely, completely, skillfully listen to another human being. And now, if the words have done their work, you are perhaps feeling a little heavy in the eyelids, a little soft around the thoughts, a little ready to close the book and let it all drift gently into your sleeping mind, where it will slowly settle and become wisdom. The mirroring, the labeling, the late-night FM DJ voice, the that's right, the love of no, let it all float there in the warm dark behind your eyes. Let it rest. Let it become yours in the end. This sleepy summary with its relaxing tone and warm glow is not meant to replace something. It is meant to honor and point toward a much larger light. It is offered with care and with the genuine hope that something in tonight's listening finds its way into you as an invitation. The whole book is waiting. The real depth lives there, in every word they chose, and every story they told, and every quiet idea they let breathe across a full page. Let this be the beginning of something you carry forward in the light of an ordinary tomorrow, and if this lamp has helped you in some way, a light keeps it burning for someone else who might need it too. Good night.